Welcome. Before we step into one of the darkest and most disturbing stories ever buried by history, tell me where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because uncovering true events like this takes deep research, lost records, and countless hours separating fact from legend. What you're about to hear is not a myth, but a chilling chapter from 1839 Texas, where desperation, violence, and secrecy led to an unthinkable alliance. An underground pact between Comanche warriors and enslaved people that would quietly erase 8 entire families and leave no official explanation behind. In 1839, Texas was a land of extremes, a place of opportunity for some and sheer terror for others. The state had only recently declared independence from Mexico, and while settlers were establishing homesteads, trading posts, and small towns, the frontier itself remained wild, lawless, and unforgiving. The terrain was harsh, ranging from dense forests to open plains, and the isolation of many settlements made them vulnerable to attack. Resources were scarce, and every family had to struggle not only against hunger and disease, but also against the constant threat of conflict, both with rival settlers and with the indigenous nations whose lands were being encroached upon. Among these indigenous nations, the Comanche were particularly formidable. Known as the Lords of the Plains, they were highly skilled horsemen and warriors, capable of striking swiftly and vanishing into the terrain before any retaliatory force could respond. For the Comanche, the influx of settlers represented an existential threat to their way of life, their hunting grounds, and their very survival. They had witnessed the steady expansion of settlements, the clearing of land, and the taking of resources that they had relied on for generations. Tensions were already high, and the Comanche were determined to resist any further encroachment, often through raids that could be both strategic and brutally punitive. Meanwhile, the enslaved population in Texas was enduring its own extreme conditions. Many were forced to work on isolated plantations, far from towns or protective communities, and they lived under constant threat of punishment, violence, and separation from family. Life as an enslaved person on the frontier was harsher than in more established southern regions, because the remoteness of settlements meant that oversight from authorities was inconsistent. Masters relied heavily on the labor of enslaved people, yet they could not always protect them from the dangers that lurked beyond the boundaries of their property. Disease, hunger, and attacks were everyday risks, and enslaved people often had to navigate a delicate balance between survival and compliance. The political and social instability of Texas in 1839 exacerbated the sense of vulnerability on both sides. Settlers were eager to claim land and expand their territories, often disregarding agreements or treaties with indigenous nations. Militias were formed haphazardly, frequently untrained and under-equipped, leaving settlements defenseless against raids. Communication between towns was slow, and news of attacks could take days or even weeks to reach authorities who might offer assistance. The lack of a strong, centralized law enforcement presence created a vacuum in which fear, mistrust, and opportunism could thrive. It was within this context of danger and unrest that the conditions for a dark and unusual alliance emerged. Both the Comanche and certain enslaved individuals had their own reasons to resist the dominance of settlers and to assert agency in ways that were otherwise impossible within the strict confines of their respective societies. For the Comanche, the ongoing conflicts were a fight for survival and sovereignty. For the enslaved people, rebellion or collaboration with outsiders represented perhaps the only possible avenue for empowerment, revenge, or protection from the extreme hardships of frontier life. In essence, 1839 Texas was a powder keg. The geographic isolation of settlements, the volatility of the political environment, and the constant threat from both indigenous warriors and other human dangers created an atmosphere in which ordinary survival became a daily challenge. Every family had to contend with the fragility of their existence, and the line between life and death could be crossed in an instant. It was within this world of fear, desperation, and opportunity that the events leading to the destruction of 8 families would take shape, setting the stage for a pact that was as dark as it was deadly. Here, on the frontier, history shows that fear often drives unlikely alliances, and extreme conditions can push people to choices that defy morality. The story of 1839 Texas is not just about settlers or Comanche warriors or enslaved people. It is about the intersection of all three, where desperation and the will to survive created circumstances that no one could have anticipated and that left consequences still buried in the shadows of history. The enslaved communities in Texas during 1839 were living under conditions that pushed the very limits of human endurance and resilience. Unlike the more established plantations of the Deep South, the frontier environment was isolated, harsh, and unpredictable. Many enslaved people were forced to work on scattered homesteads or remote plantations where the nearest neighbor could be miles away, leaving them vulnerable not only to the whims of their masters, but also to dangers from the surrounding wilderness. Disease, malnutrition, and exposure were constant threats, and the oppressive labor demands left little time for rest or reprieve. Their lives were defined by physical hardship, strict discipline, and the ever-present threat of punishment for even minor infractions. Beyond the immediate brutality of forced labor, the psychological strain on these communities was immense. Families were often separated without warning, children sold away from parents, and spouses torn from each other. Trust was scarce. Relationships had to be carefully navigated in a world where any misstep could provoke violence from overseers or owners. In addition, the broader environment of the Texas frontier added another layer of danger. The region was contested territory, with settler encroachment threatening indigenous lands and indigenous raids threatening settlements. Enslaved people were caught in the middle, often forced to labor on lands that were being fought over, their lives used as collateral in conflicts that were not of their making. For many enslaved individuals, the combination of isolation, constant labor, and systemic oppression fostered both fear and a quiet, simmering resilience. Some sought solace in communal networks, gathering at night to share stories, tend to small personal gardens, or secretly practice aspects of their native or African cultural traditions. These small acts of preservation provided a sense of identity and strength, even under the most oppressive conditions. At the same time, many enslaved people understood that rebellion or escape was fraught with extreme risk. Yet, the extreme circumstances of frontier life sometimes created opportunities for those willing to take them. The harsh conditions also bred a keen awareness of alliances and strategy. Enslaved individuals had to learn to read the behaviors of their masters, the movements of indigenous groups, and the dangers of the natural environment. Those who survived long-term on the frontier often did so because they understood timing, discretion, and subtle resistance. Some began to form clandestine networks of communication and cooperation, quietly sharing information about threats, routes for escape, and ways to protect themselves and their families. This environment of calculated caution and opportunistic alliances would ultimately set the stage for the extraordinary and dangerous pact that emerged with the Comanche warriors. It is also important to understand that these enslaved communities were not passive observers in the unfolding frontier conflicts. Their knowledge of the land, their resilience under extreme pressure, and their ability to navigate dangerous circumstances made them invaluable participants in both survival and strategic decision-making. While they lacked formal power, their insights and skills were critical in shaping outcomes, whether in the daily management of plantations or in more extraordinary circumstances that required secrecy, speed, and stealth. By 1839, desperation had reached its peak. Enslaved people were pushed to their limits physically, emotionally, and mentally. Every day brought new threats, whether from disease, violence, hunger, or environmental hazards. Under such extreme conditions, the boundaries between survival, morality, and rebellion became blurred. Acts that might have been unthinkable under more stable circumstances became possible, even necessary, in the struggle to endure. In this context, the frontier conditions of Texas created an environment ripe for extraordinary decisions. For some enslaved individuals, collaborating with indigenous groups, once considered unthinkable, offered a potential path to survival agency or revenge against a system that had stolen everything from them. It was in this desperate, high-stakes environment that alliances could form, driven by necessity, strategy, and the hope of gaining some control over their own lives. Ultimately, the extreme hardships of the enslaved communities in 1839 Texas were not simply background conditions. They were the catalyst for one of the darkest and most unusual alliances in frontier history. The combination of isolation, oppression, and knowledge of the land made it possible for enslaved individuals to engage in actions that, in ordinary circumstances, would have been impossible or unthinkable. Their desperation, courage, and strategic insight directly contributed to the events that led to the destruction of 8 families and the creation of a dark pact that history would later attempt to bury. The Comanche conflict with settlers in 1839 Texas was a defining feature of the region's violent and unpredictable frontier. For decades, the Comanche had been the dominant power on the southern plains, their mastery of horseback warfare allowing them to control vast territories and strike with precision and speed. Settlers moving into Texas disrupted not only the natural balance of the land, but also the Comanche way of life. As homesteads and plantations expanded, traditional hunting grounds were destroyed, and resources that the Comanche had relied on for generations were taken or diminished. This encroachment was perceived as an existential threat, prompting a fierce and strategic resistance. The Comanche were experts in both defensive and offensive strategies. They were highly mobile, capable of traveling hundreds of miles in a short period, and they often launched raids with a combination of stealth, intelligence gathering, and overwhelming force. Their attacks were sometimes aimed directly at settlers, livestock, or supplies, but they were also carefully calculated to destabilize communities, instill fear, and maintain dominance over the contested frontier. Settlers, in contrast, were often ill-prepared to respond. Militia forces were fragmented, poorly equipped, and inexperienced, Farms and ranches were isolated, leaving families vulnerable to sudden strikes. In this environment, settlers lived in constant fear of Comanche raids. Families fortified their homes and constructed rudimentary blockhouses. But even these defenses could be breached by small bands of highly skilled warriors. Stories circulated about attacks that occurred in the dead of night, with entire homesteads burned and livestock stolen before anyone could mount a proper defense. The psychological toll of these raids was immense. Fear became a pervasive part of daily life, shaping behavior, travel, and even social relationships among settlers. No one felt entirely safe, and mistrust of neighbors and strangers became a survival mechanism. The Comanche also understood the power of alliances and intelligence. They were able to identify weaknesses in settlements, exploit divisions among settlers, and sometimes even negotiate temporary truces to their advantage. Their raids were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations designed to exert control over the region. In some cases, they formed temporary alliances with other indigenous groups, or, more rarely, with disenfranchised settlers and enslaved people, using shared knowledge and mutual interests to further their objectives. This conflict created a unique and dangerous environment on the frontier. The Comanche were not merely resisting encroachment. They were actively reshaping the social and political landscape. Settlers had to adapt quickly, developing networks of defense, information gathering, and communication to survive. Every settlement became a microcosm of the larger struggle for control over Texas. Lives, livelihoods, and entire communities were at stake, and the consequences of failure were often deadly. The interplay between the Comanche and settlers set the stage for unlikely and secretive alliances. In some cases, individuals within the enslaved population began to recognize the strategic advantage of collaborating with the Comanche. They understood the risks, but they also saw the potential to leverage these relationships to protect themselves, retaliate against oppressive masters, or gain a degree of agency that was otherwise impossible. Such alliances were fraught with danger, requiring secrecy, trust, and careful coordination. But the extreme conditions of the frontier made them a conceivable, and in some cases, necessary strategy. By 1839, the frontier was a volatile patchwork of competing interests, where every action could carry life or death consequences. The Comanche were formidable and deeply attuned to the rhythms of the land and the vulnerabilities of settlers. Their raids were part of a broader strategy of survival, resistance, and assertion of sovereignty over a rapidly changing landscape. The settlers, meanwhile, were increasingly desperate, forced to navigate fear, limited resources, and the constant threat of attack. It was within this volatile dynamic that the conditions for the Dark Pact emerged. The extreme pressures placed on both the Comanche and the enslaved population created a convergence of interests that would otherwise have been unthinkable. The Comanche sought to protect their territory and punish encroachment, while enslaved individuals sought avenues of empowerment, revenge, or survival. The ongoing conflict, the isolation of settlements, and the constant threat of violence created an environment in which extraordinary alliances could form. Alliances that would ultimately lead to the systematic destruction of 8 families and a secret that history would later attempt to bury. In sum, the Comanche conflict with settlers in 1839 was not just a backdrop for frontier life. It was a driving force that shaped every decision, alliance, and act of survival on the Texas frontier. It demonstrated the intersection of strategy, fear, and desperation. And it was precisely this intersection that enabled the dark and deadly pact to take root, setting the stage for one of the most chilling and little-known chapters of frontier history. The secret formation of the Dark Pact between certain enslaved individuals and Comanche warriors was a product of desperation, opportunity, and shared grievances against the settlers of 1839 Texas. On the frontier, where the line between life and death was thin, extreme conditions forced people into extraordinary choices. For enslaved people, the oppressive plantation system offered no safety, no agency, and no hope for justice. Daily life was marked by brutal labor, punishment, and constant fear of family separation. For the Comanche, settlers represented an encroachment that threatened their very survival. These converging pressures created a rare alignment of interests. Despite the vast differences in culture, language, and circumstance, the initial communications between enslaved people and Comanche groups were likely cautious and fraught with danger. Any interaction carried the risk of exposure, retribution, or fatal misunderstanding. Yet necessity bred ingenuity. The enslaved, who possessed intimate knowledge of the plantations, including the routines of settlers, the layout of the land, and the vulnerabilities of isolated homesteads, offered information of immense tactical value. The Comanche, skilled in reconnaissance, swift raids, and coordinated attacks, provided the means to act on that intelligence. Together, they could plan operations that no individual group could execute alone. Trust was the most crucial element of this pact. It is remarkable to consider how two groups with such different languages, customs, and social positions could establish the necessary coordination to carry out coordinated attacks. They likely relied on covert signals, secret meeting places, and intermediaries who could move unnoticed across plantations and frontier lands. Even the smallest slip could have been deadly. Discovery would have led to brutal punishment or death for the enslaved, and violent retaliation for the Comanche. Each step of planning had to account for the pervasive presence of settler militias, armed guards, and the natural challenges of the frontier landscape. The objectives of the pact were both strategic and, for the enslaved individuals involved, deeply personal. While the Comanche sought to protect their lands and push back against encroachment, the enslaved were motivated by a combination of survival, revenge, and the desire for agency. Their knowledge of hidden routes, stockpiles of supplies, and the timing of when families were most vulnerable allowed them to guide the Comanche with precision. In this way, the pact was not merely a temporary alliance, but a coordinated system that leveraged the strengths of both groups for maximum impact. Planning for such attacks required careful timing and secrecy. The frontier's isolation worked both as a challenge and an advantage. Remote homesteads meant fewer witnesses, but they also made communication slow and difficult. To mitigate this, the pact likely used encoded signals, trusted messengers, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The enslaved individuals could move through the plantations unnoticed, conveying messages or coordinating the positioning of resources. The Comanche, for their part, could exploit their mobility, skill in stealth, and knowledge of the broader landscape to strike with precision and vanish before settlers could mount a defense. The psychological dimension of the pact was as critical as the tactical one. For the enslaved, participating in coordinated attacks against their oppressors was both a dangerous act and a cathartic one, an assertion of control in a system designed to deny them agency. For the Comanche, aligning with insiders provided an edge that amplified their already formidable capabilities. Each side had to maintain discipline, secrecy, and mutual understanding. A breach of trust could result in disaster for both groups, yet the high stakes also forged a bond that was unusual in frontier history, a temporary but lethal alliance born of necessity. Ultimately, the pact was not just about retaliation, it was about survival, empowerment, and the ability to manipulate circumstances that had otherwise trapped both groups in cycles of vulnerability. The resulting attacks on settler families were devastating precisely because they combined insider knowledge with tactical expertise. Each operation carried the weight of planning, coordination, and the intimate understanding of human behavior and geography. The Dark Pact enabled actions that no single group could have accomplished on its own, making the destruction of 8 families tragically possible. In the end, the secret formation of this alliance underscores the extreme conditions of frontier life in 1839 Texas. It highlights how desperation and shared grievances can lead to extraordinary and deadly cooperation, even between groups separated by culture, language, and social hierarchy. The pact was a rare and chilling example of how human ingenuity, when combined with the harsh pressures of survival, could produce outcomes that were as shocking as they were historically obscure. It remains a testament to the hidden layers of frontier history, where acts of desperation, cunning, and collaboration created consequences that would be deliberately buried by time and official record. The exchange of information and trust in secrecy between the enslaved individuals and Comanche warriors was a delicate and dangerous process that required meticulous planning, patience, and a deep understanding of human psychology. On the frontier of 1839 Texas, where every settlement was isolated and every action scrutinized, sharing intelligence was a matter of life and death. For the enslaved people, providing information about plantation routines, family habits, and resource locations meant risking brutal punishment or execution if discovered. For the Comanche, acting on that intelligence required careful timing, stealth, and absolute confidence that their guides could be trusted. This fragile balance of risk and reward formed the foundation of their deadly collaboration. The process likely began with observation. Enslaved individuals had intimate knowledge of the daily patterns of settler families, when they were most vulnerable, how they organized defenses, and which areas of the property were least monitored. This intelligence was critical, because the Comanche relied on precision and speed in their raids. Any misstep could mean failure or death. Small, seemingly inconsequential details, such as the timing of guard rotations or the location of hidden supplies, could dramatically alter the outcome of an attack. Sharing this information required discretion and an understanding of what was essential versus what could compromise the operation. Trust, however, was the most fragile element. Neither side could afford betrayal. The enslaved individuals had every reason to fear that discovery would lead to immediate punishment, while the Comanche understood that failure due to misinformation or deceit could result in deadly counterattacks. To mitigate these risks, communication likely relied on secret signals, hidden meeting spots, and intermediaries who could safely relay messages. Even small gestures, a particular arrangement of objects, a mark on a tree, or a coded phrase, could convey critical information without alerting outsiders. This intricate system of covert communication demonstrates the intelligence, ingenuity, and courage required by both parties to maintain the alliance. The exchange was not purely tactical, it also carried a psychological dimension. The enslaved individuals, long denied autonomy and subjected to constant oppression, found in these interactions a rare sense of power. Providing guidance to the Comanche allowed them to influence outcomes that had previously been out of their control. Conversely, the Comanche had to trust that their human guides were both knowledgeable and committed to the shared goal, a trust that was difficult to establish given cultural, linguistic, and social differences. Each successful exchange strengthened this bond, while each near failure heightened the stakes and tension between the groups. The secrecy of the alliance was further reinforced by the high level of surveillance within the settlements. Masters, overseers, and militias kept constant watch over enslaved populations, and any hint of collusion with outsiders could provoke immediate and violent retribution. To operate successfully, enslaved individuals had to master the art of appearing compliant while secretly gathering and transmitting information. Every interaction with the Comanche had to be carefully timed and meticulously executed, often under the cover of night or during moments when settler attention was diverted. Strategically, the information exchanged was decisive. It allowed the Comanche to target families with maximum effect, while minimizing their exposure to danger. The enslaved individuals provided insight into weak points, hidden paths, and routines that would otherwise have been impossible for outsiders to discern. In turn, the Comanche shared knowledge about movement, timing, and tactics, ensuring that the enslaved individuals understood the operational plan and could coordinate their guidance effectively. This mutual exchange created a synergy that was both lethal and unprecedented on the frontier. The trust between the two groups also had to account for the unpredictability of human behavior. Fear, hesitation, or miscommunication could have catastrophic consequences. Both sides had to exercise judgment, intuition, and patience, often under extreme pressure. Each success reinforced confidence, while each close call reminded them of the precariousness of their position. The ability to maintain this fragile equilibrium over time speaks to the remarkable strategic acumen and courage of the enslaved individuals and the Comanche alike. Ultimately, this careful exchange of information and trust enabled the execution of attacks that were devastatingly effective. The 8 families that were destroyed fell victim not only to the Comanches' skill in warfare, but also to the critical intelligence provided by those who knew the land and the people best. Without this secret collaboration, the precision, timing, and scope of the destruction would have been impossible. It illustrates how knowledge, when combined with courage and strategy, can become a weapon as powerful as any blade or arrow. The secrecy and trust at the heart of this alliance were crucial not only for operational success, but also for survival. Every step had to be calculated, every word measured, and every action executed with the understanding that discovery could mean death. The meticulous exchange of information between the enslaved and the Comanche stands as a testament to the ingenuity, bravery, and desperation of people pushed to the edge of survival. In the end, it was this combination of intimate knowledge, tactical intelligence, and mutual trust that made the Dark Pact so deadly and ensured that its legacy would be buried, hidden from history for generations. The systematic destruction of 8 families as a result of the dark pact between the Comanche warriors and the enslaved individuals was a chilling and meticulously executed series of events that left no survivors to fully recount what had occurred. Unlike the chaotic or opportunistic raids that were common on the Texas frontier, these attacks were precise, targeted, and carried out with a combination of insider knowledge and battlefield skill. Each family that fell victim had been studied in advance. Every routine, every vulnerability, and every point of isolation was exploited with deadly efficiency. The result was not random violence, but the calculated unraveling of lives in a way that struck fear into the surrounding communities and remained unrecorded in official history. The planning and coordination behind the attacks were extraordinary. The enslaved individuals acted as scouts, informants, and guides, knowing exactly when families would be alone or when the settlers' defenses would be at their weakest. They knew the layout of homes, barns, and supply stores, and could direct the Comanche to strike in the moments when resistance would be minimal. The Comanche, with their unmatched mobility and skill, executed the raids with rapid precision, overwhelming defenses, and leaving devastation in their wake before reinforcements could arrive. The combination of insider knowledge and tactical expertise made the attacks nearly unstoppable. Each family was struck in a different way, tailored to their unique circumstances. Some were ambushed at night while attending to livestock or household chores, their homesteads set ablaze as chaos erupted. Others were isolated while traveling to nearby towns or markets, cut off from help by the Comanches' mastery of the terrain. These attacks were not merely opportunistic. They were designed to maximize fear, disorientation, and helplessness. The families had no time to react, and in many cases, entire households were wiped out before anyone in neighboring settlements could respond. Psychologically, the attacks were devastating to the wider community. News of each family's destruction spread quickly, though details were often vague or inconsistent due to the lack of survivors. Settlers began to fear not only the Comanche, but also the possibility that enslaved individuals within their own homes might be cooperating with the enemy. Suspicion, paranoia, and terror became constant companions, further destabilizing frontier life. The efficiency of the attacks and the precision with which each family fell heightened the sense that something unnatural or incomprehensible was at work, making it even more difficult for settlers to recover or respond effectively. The destruction of these families also carried profound social consequences. Survivors in the surrounding areas were forced to abandon their homesteads, migrate to larger towns, or take refuge in fortified settlements. Communities fractured as fear eroded trust between neighbors and between settlers and their own enslaved workers. The frontier, already a dangerous and unpredictable place, became a psychological battlefield, where the terror of unknown alliances and unseen threats weighed as heavily as any physical danger. One of the most striking aspects of these attacks was the role of coordination and timing. Each strike was carefully orchestrated to avoid interference and to ensure maximum impact. The enslaved guides had to relay information without alerting masters or overseers, often under extreme scrutiny. The Comanche had to move quickly and silently, exploiting every weakness and remaining unseen until the moment of attack. This level of planning suggests not only courage and intelligence, but also an understanding of human behavior, predicting how families would respond under stress, where they would seek help, and how to isolate them completely. Despite the scale of destruction, the operation left remarkably little physical trace. The attackers avoided unnecessary bloodshed where possible, often targeting specific individuals or structures critical to the family's survival. Evidence of the attacks was minimized intentionally to prevent immediate discovery and retaliation. This careful execution contributed to the mystery and fear that surrounded the events, ensuring that settlers could only speculate about what had happened and why. The systematic nature of the destruction underscores the deadly effectiveness of the Dark Pact. It was not the result of random anger or opportunistic revenge. It was a calculated, collaborative effort that combined local knowledge with superior tactical skill. Each family's downfall reinforced the deadly reputation of the alliance, establishing a pattern of terror that extended beyond the immediate victims. The community's awareness of the threat and the lack of clear explanations amplified the psychological impact, creating an atmosphere of dread that lingered long after the attacks themselves. In the aftermath, the events were quickly obscured in both memory and official records. Authorities had little interest in pursuing a thorough investigation, particularly when the victims were settlers in remote areas and the perpetrators invisible or unidentifiable. The story of the 8 destroyed families was buried in silence, leaving only fragments of oral accounts and scattered reports to hint at the true scale of the devastation. Yet the legacy of the systematic destruction remained, serving as a grim reminder of how desperation, coordination, and intimate knowledge of one's environment could be weaponized in ways that were both terrifying and historically obscured. Ultimately, the destruction of these 8 families stands as a stark example of the consequences of the Dark Pact, a chilling testament to the deadly combination of knowledge, strategy, and desperation, and a haunting chapter in the untold history of the Texas frontier. It illustrates how alliances formed under extreme conditions can produce outcomes that are both devastating and meticulously executed, leaving echoes of fear and mystery that endure long after the events themselves have passed into obscurity. The failure of authorities to investigate or record the truth behind the destruction of the 8 families in 1839, Texas highlights the complex social, political, and logistical realities of frontier life at the time. The region was remote, sparsely populated, and largely disconnected from the emerging legal and governmental structures of the young Republic of Texas. Settlements were often isolated by miles of wilderness, rivers, and rough terrain, making it difficult for any formal response to reach them quickly. Militia units were underfunded, poorly trained, and frequently preoccupied with other conflicts, leaving entire communities without reliable protection. This lack of infrastructure created an environment in which violence could occur with minimal oversight, and in which a well-planned series of attacks could leave devastating consequences without prompting a meaningful investigation. Additionally, the broader social dynamics complicated any attempt at accountability. Enslaved people were legally considered property, and their lives and actions were often dismissed or ignored by authorities. As a result, any possibility of collaboration between the enslaved and the Comanche would have been difficult to uncover or prosecute. Even if evidence existed, settlers themselves were often suspicious of one another and rumors of betrayal or collusion could inflame tensions without ever producing actionable information. The authorities, focused on maintaining order in an already chaotic frontier, frequently prioritized immediate threats, such as Comanche raids or disputes among settlers, over the painstaking investigation of a complex conspiracy involving both indigenous groups and enslaved populations. The secrecy and efficiency of the pact also contributed to the lack of records. The enslaved individuals involved understood the need for discretion, moving in ways that avoided detection while providing crucial intelligence. The Comanche executed their raids with speed and precision, striking in a manner that left minimal physical evidence and few witnesses. By the time neighbors or local authorities became aware of the attacks, the perpetrators had vanished into the wilderness or returned to the plantations undetected. This combination of insider knowledge and tactical skill made it nearly impossible for authorities to reconstruct events accurately, and any surviving accounts were often fragmentary, inconsistent, or dismissed as folklore. Moreover, there were political and social incentives to bury the truth. Settlers and local officials were deeply invested in maintaining the appearance of order and control, even in the face of devastating losses. Acknowledging that enslaved people could collaborate with indigenous groups to destroy entire families challenged the prevailing narratives of dominance and racial hierarchy, undermining the perceived authority of slaveholders and frontier leaders. Public recognition of such an alliance might have incited panic, rebellion, or unrest, which authorities were keen to avoid. Consequently, official records either ignored the incidents entirely or treated them in vague, incomplete terms that left future generations without a clear understanding of what had occurred. The logistical difficulties of investigation also cannot be overstated. Travel across the frontier was slow and dangerous. Roads were primitive or non-existent, and natural obstacles such as rivers, dense forests, and swamps hindered rapid movement. Any attempt by authorities to reach the sites of the attacks would have taken days or weeks, by which time evidence would have degraded, witnesses dispersed, and the trail of the Comanche and their collaborators gone cold. Communication networks were limited, with messages often carried by horseback over long distances, delaying the coordination necessary for a proper investigation. Furthermore, fear played a role in suppressing inquiry. Settlers who had survived the attacks or witnessed signs of the pact were often reluctant to speak openly. Fear of retaliation from the Comanche, suspicion of neighbors, or concern about uncovering the involvement of enslaved individuals created a culture of silence. People learned quickly that asking too many questions could be dangerous, leading to self-censorship and the perpetuation of rumor rather than verified accounts. This climate of fear ensured that even those with knowledge of the events often kept it to themselves, leaving authorities with little actionable information. Finally, the lack of investigation underscores the broader theme of historical erasure. The combination of frontier isolation, racial hierarchy, and social fear meant that the story of the 8 families and the Dark Pact was effectively written out of official records. The events were remembered only in fragments, passed down orally or preserved in obscure references that rarely found their way into historical documentation. This erasure not only concealed the truth from contemporary authorities, but also delayed recognition of the agency, strategy, and courage of the enslaved individuals and the tactical skill of the Comanche, whose alliance had been so deadly and decisive. In essence, the failure of authorities to investigate or record the truth was not simply a matter of negligence. It was the result of a confluence of frontier isolation, social dynamics, secrecy, and fear. These factors combined to create a historical vacuum in which one of the most chilling and unusual alliances of the Texas frontier could operate undetected, leaving destruction in its wake and a story that would remain buried, misunderstood, or forgotten for generations. The inability or unwillingness of the authorities to intervene ensured that the dark pact's consequences would resonate silently through history, a haunting testament to the dangers and complexities of life on the frontier. The deliberate burial of the Dark Pact and its consequences by history reflects not only the secrecy of the events themselves, but also the social, political, and cultural forces that shaped which stories were recorded and remembered. In 1839 Texas, the frontier was already chaotic, and authorities were often focused on immediate, tangible threats rather than the underlying networks that allowed violence to occur. The coordinated destruction of 8 families by an alliance of Comanche warriors and enslaved people challenged conventional narratives of power, control, and morality, and acknowledging it publicly would have been deeply uncomfortable for both settlers and officials. As a result, those who survived or knew the truth often remained silent, and the record was shaped not by accuracy, but by omission and selective memory. Historical erasure was reinforced by the racial and social hierarchies of the time. Enslaved people were legally property and largely invisible within official records, except when their labor or punishment was documented. Their agency, intelligence, and participation in events that could influence life or death were systematically ignored. Similarly, indigenous groups like the Comanche were often depicted in simplistic or demonized terms, reducing their complex strategies and alliances to one-dimensional raids in settler accounts. Together, these biases created a historical narrative that left out the most critical elements of the events: the strategic collaboration, the intelligence, and the calculated execution of the attacks. By failing to document these elements, history effectively obscured the truth, leaving only fragments of folklore and oral tradition to hint at the full story. The act of burying the story also served a psychological and social purpose for the settler community. The idea that enslaved people could collaborate with indigenous groups to destroy entire families was terrifying, undermining the perception of absolute control that plantation owners and frontier leaders believed they held. Public acknowledgement of the alliance could have inspired panic, encouraged rebellion, or sparked retaliatory violence, destabilizing an already fragile frontier society. Silence and selective record-keeping became tools of control, allowing settlers to maintain the illusion of order while avoiding the uncomfortable truth of their vulnerability and the consequences of systemic oppression. Over time, this deliberate suppression of the story ensured that the Dark Pact would fade from the public record, leaving future generations with only scattered accounts and partial knowledge. Oral traditions persisted in local communities, but these stories were often fragmented, exaggerated, or veiled in metaphor to protect the storytellers from social or legal repercussions. Folklore preserved the memory of fear, destruction, and vengeance, but it rarely captured the full scope of the pact or the calculated intelligence behind the attacks. the truth was filtered through layers of caution, cultural bias, and time, making it increasingly difficult for historians to reconstruct events with certainty. The burial of the story also reflects a broader pattern in history, where the actions and agency of marginalized groups are systematically obscured or minimized. The enslaved people who risk everything to collaborate with the Comanche were denied recognition, while the Comanche's strategic prowess was often simplified or demonized. By failing to record the full context of these events, history erased the complexity and nuance of frontier life, creating a sanitized version that ignored both the courage and the desperation of those involved. This erasure contributed to a narrative in which settlers were the primary actors and victims, while the ingenuity, intelligence, and survival strategies of others were largely invisible. In essence, the story was buried because it was inconvenient, unsettling, and challenged the dominant social order. Acknowledging it would have required confronting uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, oppression, and agency on the frontier. The consequences of the Dark Pact, 8 families destroyed, communities terrified, and social hierarchies challenged, were too threatening to be admitted openly. By suppressing the story, authorities and communities were able to maintain a sense of moral and social order, even as the events themselves remained unrecorded and unexamined. Yet, the very act of being buried ensured that the story retained a haunting presence. Fragments survived in oral histories, local lore, and whispered accounts passed down through generations. These remnants preserved the memory of the alliance, the destruction, and the fear it generated, even if the details were obscured. Over time, the story became both a historical mystery and a cautionary tale about the limits of power, the consequences of oppression, and the resilience of those who are forced to navigate extreme circumstances. Ultimately, the deliberate burial of the Dark Pact underscores the interplay between memory, power, and history. It reveals how selective documentation, cultural bias, and social fear can shape collective understanding, leaving certain events hidden while others are amplified. The story of the 8 destroyed families and the deadly alliance between enslaved people and Comanche warriors was not lost because it lacked significance. It was erased because it threatened the narratives of control, morality, and dominance that frontier society relied upon. Its survival in fragmented accounts and oral tradition is a testament to the persistence of truth, even in the face of deliberate historical suppression, and serves as a haunting reminder of the shadows that lie behind the official record.